Well, welcome everyone to today's World Court of Human Rights Coalition meeting. I'm David Gallup, and I'm the convener of the coalition, here with Mark Ottinger, who is the director of the World Court of Human Rights design team, which helped to completely draft one of the versions of the statutes for the World Court of Human Rights. And we're here with Professor Susan Bitensky, who I'll introduce here momentarily after just providing a couple quick updates about the coalition. Um, and for time's sake, if everyone would like to introduce themselves in the chat, please do so, telling us what organization you might represent and a little bit about yourself. Thank you for doing that. So I can tell you that I just went on the NGO branch for the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations to see whether the status of our application for our World Citizenship Foundation to have advisory or status with ECOSOC had been accepted, and it's still in pending status. I do know that for over the last month, their website was down, and I couldn't check on it at all. So I don't know if that has anything to do with perhaps the delay in the clearance of an officer at the UN. Of course, the importance of us having consultative status would be for us to be on the UN campus and meet with the third and sixth committees of the UN, which talk about treaties as well as international law. So we are still seeking government outreach coordinators. If any of you know individuals who would like to volunteer, we're all a volunteer team. Please let me know, and I'll put my direct email in the chat a little later. Also, I want to thank, she's not here today because she's in training, but there's a student named Danielle Gardner, who's also the vice chair of programs for the American Bar Association International Human Rights Committee. And she was a student of Professor Bitensky in Professor Bitensky's human rights class. And that's how we were introduced. So I'm sorry she can't make it today, but I'm glad that she had introduced us. So now I'd like to introduce Professor Susan Bitensky. She teaches courses on human rights, constitutional law, jurisprudence, and evidence at Michigan State University College of Law. She has published the book Corporal Punishment of Children, a Human Rights Violation, and has written many law review and legal-related publications regarding children's rights and the right to education, among others. Recently, she has focused her research on writing and advocating for a people's right under international law to armed UN intervention against mass atrocities, urging the U.S. Supreme Court to recognize a fundamental right to vote per se under the Constitution and providing the doctrinal bases for doing so, and demonstrating that possession of nuclear weapons negates the rule of law. She was the founding director of the Talsky Center for Human Rights of Women and Children, which she ran for 6 years. And I'm really delighted to have you here, Susan, today to speak with us. And I think your focus may be about how nuclear weapons negate international law. And we may have other questions for you about some of your other research, or as you mentioned to me in an email, we'd love to have you back perhaps to talk about other things. If we don't get to, for example, your research on a mass atrocities court today, we can get to that maybe in another meeting in the future. So anyway, the floor is yours. Please tell us what you'd like to talk to us about today. And then, of course, we'll leave some time at the end for questions.
Thank you very much. It's really my honor and pleasure to be here today. I'm very excited to hear about the effort to establish a World Human Rights Court. I think it's long overdue, and I hope that it will be successful. And actually, I'd like to become involved in the effort. But as I indicated to David, today I'm going to talk about how nuclear weapons, their very existence, and of course the threat of use or use of them, is a negation of the rule of law, which of course includes international law. So, as we all know, in a sort of abstract way. I don't think many of us stop to think about this too deeply because about the threat of nuclear weapons, because it's very threatening. And indeed, it's an existential threat, not just to human beings, but to the ecosystem, to the existence of the planet itself. And we live with this constant backdrop. It affects us psychologically in ways that I think are very profound. I have no idea how extensive they may be, but we're in a constant state of denial, really. And the only other threat that I can think of that is as far reaching is climate change. And other problems, as important as they are, just pale before this one. So let me just first say a word about international law's application to nuclear weapons. For decades, international lawyers, scholars, and practitioners have been arguing that the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons violates international law. And they were doing so without the benefit of a treaty expressly saying so. But now, I think in large part due to the pressure of these scholars and practitioners, now there is a treaty. And it is called, it was adopted by the UN in 2017, and it is called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's very, very strong. Article 1D, as in dog, says states must never, under any circumstances, use or threaten to use nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. There are no exceptions. However, to date, not a lot of countries have ratified this treaty, so it has a long way to go. But at least it's there now. And it puts international law on record as making illegal any use or any threat of use of the weapons. What I'm going to focus on today is that there are three respects in which nuclear weapons negate the very rule of law. Their very existence, I contend, negates, abrogates the rule of law, or just destroys it. Excuse me. Secondly, in the United States, our powers that be basically disregard the rule of law in relation to nuclear weapons. And finally, in the United States, our government grossly violates the rule of law with respect to these weapons. So let me get into the weeds. To understand my arguments, I have to acquaint you with several facts, some of which are kind of unsavory, so I apologize in advance for them. Starting with less upsetting facts, let me tell you that there, including Israel, there are now 9 nations that have nuclear weapons. And disturbingly, I mean, that's disturbing enough, but even more disturbing, in each country, it is only a single person or a very small coterie of people who have the power to launch the weapons. And so if you sit back and think about that, what we are all around the world saddled with is a de facto international regime of the few over the many, that is the rest of humanity, um, with respect to and a power that has the potential to extinguish us. And right away, I think for Americans who have grown up with the idea of the importance of democracy, that is alarming. Okay, the few over the many, with really no check on the few. So let's talk about what I've been hinting at um, the last few minutes, and that is the effects of nuclear weapons. And this is something that's I got to tell you, I wrote a law review article uh, on the topic of the weapons as a negation of international law. It was very hard to do some of this research. Um, it, I didn't sleep at night. Let me just say that. So first, let me talk about the effects on human beings. At the hypocenter of the blast, right where the blast occurs, within seconds, people are vaporized. I can't even get my head around what that is. How does it feel to be vaporized? Um, it's very frightening. One witness to the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima describes how, from a distance, he saw a man walking on a bridge right near the hypocenter. And all of a sudden, there was no man, there was just a shadow of a man. So, in addition to that, that's just the beginning. And actually, I forget which Russian or Soviet leader had said this, but um, he made the remark that actually the people on the outskirts of the hypocenter and still further out actually should envy the people who were destroyed at the hypocenter because the human suffering then increases exponentially as you move out. So, of course, we're talking about radioactive fallout, but we're also talking about toxic gases that are created by the bomb destroying infrastructure, agricultural sites, etc. Now, radiation, if you're very close in and you get a really walloping dose of this stuff, it kills and sickens people in rather horrible ways. Um, the progression to death is nausea, vomiting, excessive thirst, fever, diarrhea, losing your hair in clumps, lesions, gangrene, hemorrhaging, including from one's eyes, blood injuries to the bone marrow, and just in case that's not enough, genetic injuries, so that injury is passed down to future generations. Then there is shockwave injuries. The shock waves from an atomic blast are also horrific. And the Well, I'm going to read you just two examples of what shock waves do. And forgive forgive me for sharing this because it'll be hard to get out of your heads. But you have to know what we're talking about here. So, these are two real examples from Hiroshima. First, a mother, this is a quote, A mother driven half mad while looking for her child was calling his name. At last she found him. His head looked like a boiled octopus. His eyes were half closed, and his mouth was white, pursed, and swollen. So that one follows me around wherever I go. And then the second example is equally disturbing. Quote, this is from Japanese people who were in the vicinity at the time of the explosion. Quote, while taking my severely wounded wife out to the riverbank by the side of the hill of Nakahiro Machi, I was horrified, indeed, at the sight of a stark naked man standing with his eyeball in his palm. So, this is terrible. Among other effects of the radiation and of the shock waves, they cause cancer, blood abnormalities, thyroid failure, and gonadal irradiation. That's mainly of course, the radioactive fallout effects. Then we haven't even touched on psychological harms, which also are profound. The leader in this field is Dr. Robert J. Lifton, and he has done study after study on this. I'll just share a couple of the psychological effects. First, for those near the hypocenter, they are left with the delusion that they're not really alive. Second, there is what Dr. Lifton called a psychic closing off. That is, because this is so unbearable in its effects, the victims can't afford to feel. And so their brains, their bodies react accordingly by not allowing the person to feel. There is survivor's guilt. And then there is hypochondria with a vengeance that victims are left with. So that's a capsule description of what happens to people. The environment is destroyed. Just like we are destroyed, animals are destroyed. And, I find this so reprehensible, because whereas we humans created these weapons, we are guilty, the other animals did not. And they are such innocent victims. It's just heartbreaking. Even from a regional nuclear explosion, I'm not talking about an all-out, exchange between Russia and America, but just a regional exchange, we could expect to suffer from nuclear winter, which means that the sun will be blocked off, crops can't be grown, and so what will follow will be international profound famine. One writer has said that what would be left just from a regional exchange is, quote, a republic of insects and grass, close quote. And I think that's pretty optimistic on the grass front. Of course, all of our infrastructure would be decimated. And if you stop and think about that, it's mind-boggling. Healthcare system, gone. Banking and finance, gone. Law, the legal system, gone. Education, gone. The electric grid, gone, and so on. Okay, enough about that happy subject. Let me now just briefly turn to what is the rule of law. So I think we all sort of feel, whether we're jurists or not, we know what the rule of law is. But when you start really getting into it, it's not at all clear. And in fact, in the academy, this is a highly disputed concept. What the hell is it, right? However, I was able from a lot of research to distill one principle upon which all jurists agree as marking the rule of law. And that is the following, that there should be a government of laws and not men, meaning men and women. So what that distills down to is that the rule of law really is the minimization of persons' discretion in carrying out programs that we have decided should be subject to law. Minimization of discretion. Now, that principle of agreement I have embellished for my own use because rule of law bothers me in the way it is conceived by some people. And that is, it is conceived, for example, let's go back to Nazi Germany. They had laws. And the rule of law in Nazi Germany was not a pretty picture. And it's not something we would want to see repeated. So for me, the rule of law is a civilizational obligation to enforce or apply the laws so as to minimize discretion in that enforcement or application. I use the word civilizational in the sense that civilization means that we are trying to live in an orderly, nonviolent, humane way. So, but after going through all that, actually, in my analysis, the definition, my hair standing up on end, that's due to my discussion of the effects of nuclear weapons. So the definition ultimately doesn't matter because all definitions of the rule of law are eviscerated. Rule of law is eviscerated in any form by the existence of nuclear weapons. So let me explain. Now, this next point, here I get into my argument now, and the point I'm going to make, the first point, is one of those things where you really say to yourself, "Duh, you really have to say that?" And I feel like yes. Or as a friend of mine, I was discussing writing this article with a friend of mine who's a lawyer. And I said, maybe I shouldn't write this because this first point is so obvious. And he said, somebody's got to say it. And I thought about it, and he's right. So here it comes. The effects of nuclear weapons use that I just shared with you in the geographical areas where the nuclear exchange occurs means there's no rule of law. As I said before, all human endeavors, all human infrastructure is destroyed. And that includes the legal system. No legal system, no rule of law, just chaos. So there is a multifaceted collapse, and what is left is chaos. The people left in existence have no law to look to, no rule of law. Okay, that's pretty obvious. It's pretty horrifying, but that is one way in which use of nuclear weapons does abrogate the rule of law. But now let's focus on the United States. And here I'm going to share with you some facts that when I first encountered them, I just found so amazing, so startling. And let me focus first on in the United States, the very existence, I'm not talking about use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. The very existence of these weapons is a total disregard for law. And to explain this, let's turn to the president's role as commander in chief under the Constitution. I think many jurists already realize this. Maybe many don't. Certainly the lay public doesn't. The president in that role has absolute and sole power over the use of nuclear weapons. Only he or she can launch them. Once that order goes out, it cannot be countermanded. It can't be checked. Once it is verified that it is the president issuing the order to launch, that's it. That's a lot of power in one person, I submit to you. And let's look into the history of how did the president get such a gargantuan, unlimited power to destroy not just all Americans, but people around the world and the whole biosphere. This power has no genesis in law. If you look at the Constitution, of course, there's no explicit allocation of such power to the president as commander in chief or as anything else. Some theorists have made the argument, well, this power is implicitly in the president's commander in chief power. But those are weak, very weak arguments. They have really been put to rest by most of the legal community. So where does the power come from? Actually, it comes from a power grab by President Truman and the US military. Because of a series of secret Cold War period decisions by Truman in cahoots with the military, the power was just usurped by the executive branch. And so there's no genesis for this power in law. It is purely an instance of raw power in aggrandizing the power to launch. Not only is that very disturbing, that there's no genesis in law for the power, but it has another iniquitous effect. Because these decisions were basically secret and have only recently started to come to light, the lack of clarity on this has created a sort of mystique surrounding the president's power. That, he must have or she must have this power. We don't really know why, but he's just got to. Um, and so, how do you assail that? How do you even deal with a mystical, essentially a mystical power imbued in the present? So we live we live with that lawlessness every single hour of our existence. For years, since the Truman presidency, we've lived with. We are living with a total disregard for law in the most fundamental way with respect to the most awesome power. I just find that breathtaking. Um, the second way in the United States that we are living with a gross um, disregard, or really a gross violation of the rule of law, is that this setup that I've just shared with you is a gross violation of the American Constitution's commitment to democratic governance. First of all, even assuming that there were a legal basis for the president's power to use nuclear weapons, that's one hell of a power in one man or woman. And I think just putting that power, even if we did so in a regularized legal way, in one person is anti-democratic. But there's other ways in which democracy is just run roughshod over by this power being allocated as it is. If you go through the Constitution, and in my law review article, I do this, there's just a myriad of ways that the Constitution indirectly commits us to democratic governance. Look at the senators' power to ratify treaties. Look at how representatives, senators must be elected. And even things like the free speech clause, which has been interpreted to prohibit muzzling people when they give voice to their political or other views. That's a part of democracy too. So the allocation of this power to the president is a rude blow to democracy, and to democracy as it is ensconced in the Constitution. I will read you a quote from a kindred spirit fellow jurist. He said, quote, "Lodging the fate of the world in one person with no constitutional check on his actions has caused a violent break in our whole governmental system." And indeed, Congress has no check over the president's use of nuclear weapons. Checks and balances, separation of powers, that's out the window, right? And our courts have no jurisdiction to review use or threat of use of these weapons. So it is a violent tear in our government and commitment to democracy. So you might wonder, well, that's all very interesting in a harrowing kind of way. So what do we do about it? Well, if I had my druthers, if I was czar of the world, Tsarina, speaking of putting power in one person, I would eliminate these weapons and make it so they can't come back. However, I don't want to be Tsarina, and I'm not. So I've come up with a rather modest, admittedly modest proposal, but I think it's where we have to start. And so it's that old adage of talking truth to power. Well, not only talking truth to power, but also talking truth to our fellow Americans and people around the world about what this situation really is. First of all, I think people have to be educated about the effects of these weapons, um, unpleasant as that is. People need to know what this existential threat is. And by the way, I neglected to say earlier, according to two U.S. defense secretaries, former defense secretaries, let me find my paraphrase here. We are on the brink. The former Defense Secretary William Perry and Robert McNamara have said, quote, only blind luck has saved us. Because, I should have added this earlier, but better late than never, even if there's no intentional use of nuclear weapons, man, have we come close. There have been so many accidents that nearly resulted in dropping of nuclear weapons. So it's really scary reading to read about the many accidents. So we have to tell people about that as well. There's an existential threat, not just from intentional use. And boy, with Putin threatening every other day to use nuclear weapons, we've got plenty of that. But also accidental use. But we also have to tell Americans especially that this power to use nuclear weapons being rooted exclusively in the presidency is an abrogation of the rule of law. And I think these days, since Trump has been around, I hope I'm not offending anybody's sensibilities, I'm betting I'm not, but since Trump has been around, rule of law has become more and more in the news because many of us are very scared that were he to ascend to the presidency again, we can wave goodbye to the rule of law. So rule of law is something we're very concerned with these days, but little do we stop to think that we're living with it every single day, with or without Trump, okay, because of this power to launch nuclear weapons being solely in the president's purview. So I think we have to bring this out. We have to bring out that actually the genesis of this power is an illegal one. It's not only not rooted in law, it exists due to a power grab, an illegal power grab. And that needs to be, I submit, that needs to be rectified. And I think that our government we need to demand, the people need to demand that it be rectified in a way that will further democracy and in a way that will regularize things vis-a-vis legal oversight. So finally, I think ultimately, because of the effects of nuclear weapons, because of their negation of the rule of law that we all want to live by, um, I think people ultimately have to be inspired, even pressured, to lobby and um, become activists for the elimination of these weapons. You know, we created them, we can get rid of them. We have the technological know how. And, you know, we have in international law, we have regimes, we have treaties outlawing the use of noxious gases, poisonous gases in warfare. We have a treaty now against use of mines in warfare. And so we're able to do this. And in fact, I shared with you at the beginning of my presentation, there's a treaty now promulgated by the UN prohibiting use or even threat of use of nuclear weapons. We can do this. We have the technological know-how. We have the legal know-how. So that is my presentation on this topic. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Susan. Wow, that was, you're right, difficult to hear, especially about the effects, but I think it is so important to hear about the effects of nuclear weapons. And there's a film called The World Is My Country about the founder of the organization where I work, who lived through World War II. He was a bomber pilot in World War II and gave up his U.S. citizenship. And in that documentary, they do actually show the effects of nuclear weapons, and it's hard to watch, certainly. I guess the first question, we'll open us up to questions for everybody, I guess, but my first question that comes to mind, sort of thinking uh, like a lawyer, whether that's fortunate or unfortunate, um, is that if, and I don't know if this has ever happened, if anybody in a U.S. court has tried to take the threat or use of nuclear weapons as a challenge to the U.S. government in court in the United States. But I could just imagine that if that happened, it would go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and that the Supreme Court would, as they generally do in many kind of quote unquote national security, public order, public health cases, they will that allows them to abrogate from perspective of universal rights. And then they would say, well, no, for national security, the commander in chief has to have this power, right? And like you said, there may not even be any valid legal basis other than to say, well, national security. So I guess my question about that is, has anything like that happened? I mean, what do you foresee from a taking it through a legal case perspective, not just the lobbying and education?
Yeah, I don't know. That's the most accurate answer to your question. However, I will say this. I don't think such a cause of action will get very far due to principles of standing. Specifically, this is a political question, right? And the court wouldn't take jurisdiction over it. Now, there have been the World Court actually did deal with a case, the UN's World Court, that was brought, many years ago. And it was to me, it was very disappointing. The argument was made that the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons violates international law, various aspects of international law. And the court, I don't remember the exact parameters of the decision, except that they refused. Some justices in dissent did agree with the petitioners, but the majority refused to go along with it.
Yeah.
So there was a caveat in there, and I cannot recall what it was.
Well, what I recall from that case, it was 1996 at the ICJ. I think it was the
Right.
Health Organization that brought that case for an advisory opinion that the court actually did say that the threat and use of nuclear weapons is illegal. It might even be considered a crime against humanity because it would destroy humanity, like you were saying. But they gave a loophole, which was for what is it called? Protection.
Defensive use.
No, for protection of the say for defense, for self-defense.
That's what yeah.
Yeah. The nuclear weapons could be used, and I know there was a judge, Weeramantry, in
Yes,
India, who in his dissent said that one self-defense loophole destroys the whole argument of it because what nuclear weapon state who has the power to use these weapons isn't going to say, well, this is for self-defense, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Um, he, the decision by that judge, the opinion, actually is near and dear to my heart because I have to make a true confession here. My husband has been a leading expert on the illegality of the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons under international law. He and Richard Falk, I don't know if you know who he is, wrote the seminal paper on this. And my husband then wrote a whole book on it. So, and the judge cited the book. So,
That's amazing.
thank you.
Yeah.
My claim to fame through my
Sure.
husband.
I see. Yeah, no, well,
And
uh,
well,
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. So let me open up the floor to questions from anyone. And well, just raise your hand, or you could. There's so few of us, you can take yourself off mute if you'd like to ask a question. And I mean, I guess while we're waiting for someone to do that, another question that comes to my mind is um, how you think perhaps if we were to create a World Court of Human Rights, if that would have or could have standing to look at this issue from a human rights perspective.
Well, the a new world court isn't bound by of course, American standards of standing. So, and obviously, it's one of those things we sort of all know, but maybe it needs to be stated and litigated that even a regional use of nuclear weapons would destroy every single human right ever put on the books or conceived of. So, it may be that these weapons are the ultimate destroyer of human rights because they destroy humanity.
Yeah.
That's kind of a simplistic response, but it's the best I can do at the moment.
Yes. Okay. Well, I can tell you there were Gary Davis, who founded the organization where I've worked for the past almost 33 years. He tried to, as an individual stateless world citizen, take a case to the International Court of Justice to sue Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev as threatening humanity with nuclear weapons. But of course, the ICJ said, no, you're an individual, you don't have standing. And then when the International Criminal
Really?
Court, yeah, when the International Criminal Court came along, he tried to make a case against the 9 nuclear weapons heads of state, saying they're putting
Right.
humanity at risk. This is a crime against humanity, which is now one of the prongs, I think, although I don't know if they've ever used it in the crime against humanity as a prong of jurisdiction in the International Criminal Court. And he sent it, registered return receipt petition, and they never acknowledged it, which is kind of ridiculous. But I think, if they couldn't acknowledge it and they couldn't not acknowledge it by leaving it, not doing anything. That was probably the only thing they could do, because if they acknowledged it, they would have to say, yes, of course, the threat or use of nuclear weapons is illegal, that it can't happen. And if they said no, well, then they would sort of negate themselves as a court of law, sort of like you're saying about the rule of law when it comes to nuclear weapons being non-existent.
Well, uh, two things occur to me as you were talking, and they occurred to me and then they left.
Oh gosh.
um, Um,
Well,
I really had an important point to make, but I'm
it
sorry
may come
to
back.
deprive
Well,
you.
yeah, well,
It'll come to me at 3 in the morning, and I
right,
will
right. So
pull
that's
you off.
okay. That's okay. Yeah, I mean, I just think to get any court to sort of challenge the power that these nation states have um, is almost is almost impossible. So I think you're right about us being the individuals being the change makers. I mean, I think it's amazing that the TPNW, exists, but the fact that none of the nuclear states, and then of course other states, have even joined that and maybe never
Oh,
will. Yes.
it came to me. It
Yeah.
came. Okay. So, the I think people are so resistant to thinking about trying to dismantle nuclear weapons. It's just they can. I think most people, terrible generalization, but I do think most people feel, hey, this is just part of our backdrop, our landscape. It's like, yeah, there's a sky, there's an earth, there's nuclear weapons. And in fact, I'll tell you this. My experience in trying to publish this article was very upsetting to me. Um, this is a little bit of a boast, but it has a purpose. Most of my law review articles have been published either in leading law reviews or middle of the pack at worst. I could not find any law review that would take this article except two of them, Quinnipiac and Hamline, which are at the very bottom of the rankings. And I went with Quinnipiac because I wanted to get it out there. But of course, when you publish in a lower ranked journal, you're not going to get credibility, you're not going to get attention. And it's very peculiar that this is the only article I have had this experience with. So I think there's a real resistance to in the legal community uh, to thinking about, much less getting really involved in doing something about this issue and acknowledging what the weapons are doing to us every single day.
When you say that, what comes to mind is I wonder whether some of the law schools whose law reviews you may have wanted to publish your article in are invested in nuclear weapons production, companies, and because of that, they felt that they couldn't allow for this kind of almost dissent to the money making that they need for their school. I don't know. I mean, do you think that's
Well,
part of it, or
well, that was the second point I was going to make that had escaped me. We're talking about uh, in tackling this problem, we're talking about upending the system. There are a lot of economic vested interests in the military industrial complex that we're discussing. We're discussing a secretly originated power of the president that presidents may not want to dilute or cede. So we really, this is such an uphill battle because we have the whole system vested interests arrayed against change, and that's why I think the impetus for change really has to come from the people. As corny as that may sound, um, I don't see an alternative.
Susan, you're right in some respects, I think, but um, and this is really kind of a question to everybody as well. You mentioned that one of the kind of strategies that we could have would be for education, but for the amount we know with climate change, the amount there is so much education out there on climate change, and yet there is an equal amount of misinformation out there to counter it. So I'm not sure that even if we were to put out all the information that's ever, there's ever been published and researched, whether people would actually believe it, because there'd be an equal amount of counter information out there. So I don't know whether educate. One thing that might have an effect, and we can take this from COVID, is when we had COVID and we had a kind of a national emergency or an international emergency, and we were told, well, you have to wear face masks and you have to stay at home and you have to have a jab. And most people are reasonably compliant when they're told to do something by their government. Yes, you'll always get a few that will say, no, I'm not doing that. I don't care. It's a conspiracy. It's this, it's that, it's whatever. But most people are compliant when they're told to do something, whether it's by a police officer, by anybody in power. They're compliant. Whether it's the sergeant major in the army, they're compliant. So what I think we kind of need to do is we need to change it at the top, so that so that comes down from the top, so that people are then told, you will think this way, you will do this. It's a bit dictatorial, but I think if we do it from the bottom up with people, it'll go nowhere.
I think you're right, but I think that we have to mount a many-pronged attack. That is, I would continue to keep pounding this education-wise at the mass level. But I think you're right. What would be very powerful and needs to happen is messages from the top. Because in my view, actually, law is education. Law is a lot more, but it's also an educational message from the lawmakers that this is what we value. This is what you should value, because you've got to comply with the law. And so I think that what you propose has to happen. I also think litigation is very important on this, because it does highlight the issue for people, and to some extent it's limited. That makes the airwaves, right? That gets some media attention, and that is a form of education also. So I say, let's go full throttle on all fronts. But I agree with you, just pounding the message from the bottom by itself, it's probably not going to do a lot. It may help some.
I would add, Susan, that us coming from the bottom perspective, that this is why it's so important to vote, and who we vote for are leaders, rather than misleaders, that we hope to put at the top will be the people that will, in the end, as Robin was suggesting, change our minds. And we may change who's there, and if they follow what we want, saying we don't want nuclear weapons anymore, that they would then hopefully have the power to implement that. So it has to come from both, as you were just saying. Erica has a question here. She says, in the context of a global cost of living crisis, where individuals are primarily focused on day-to-day survival, how can we effectively engage the public in understanding the importance of nuclear non-proliferation and its long-term impact on global security and economic stability? So I guess it's, her point is, we're so focused on just our daily trying to survive, how do we refocus people's minds on such a crucial issue?
I agree with you, Erica. The middle class and the working class and below, we are all concerned about cost of living issues, day-to-day existence is a struggle for most people in most countries these days. And that should continue to be front and center on people's agendas. But it's interesting you use the word survival, day-to-day survival. I contend, and I think it's not a leap at all, to say part of that day-to-day survival involves not being vaporized by a nuclear weapon. And maybe that message needs to be integrated with these other struggles. I don't know if that's responsive or not.
Well, I mean, I think it would have been nice in my social studies class, maybe not in elementary school, but maybe by middle school or something, to have learned more about the effects of nuclear weapons. But I don't remember that. I don't know if anybody else here remembers having, had that kind of education, which is sad. So I think that's really important. Yeah.
What I remember, actually, and I'm dating myself now if my hair hadn't already done it, is when I was in elementary school and middle school, I remember there being drills where we had to, oh, this was rich, we had to go under our desks uh, as a protection against nuclear holocaust. And then there was another version of this where we had to go into the hallways and bend down, kneel down next to our lockers. So very effective. And it scared me. It scared the bejesus out of me. But it did nothing more than that.
Yeah. Well, so scaring isn't necessarily an effective education tool.
Not by itself.
Yeah, right, exactly. Okay, Mark has a comment. Go ahead, Mark.
So thank you so much for coming and speaking with us on this very important work. Getting back to something you said in the beginning, which was, if a cause of action is filed somewhere at the ICJ or at a World Court of Human Rights, trying to test the legality as a matter of public international law of nuclear weapons. And I do remember the Weiramentry case. He, I think, at that time was the number two on the ICJ, as a matter of fact. And he wrote a really, really good dissent. Um, when Russia invaded Ukraine recently, one of the things that happened was that there were petitions filed at both the ICJ and the ICC. And both of those courts responded relatively quickly, because the situation wasn't purely a political question or a non-justiciable question. It was happening in real time. Now let's hope that we don't have to have the so-called tactical, and I've never understood that word, use of nuclear weapons as a precursor to actually a court considering the legality of nuclear war. But it strikes me that, when you hear somebody like Putin threatening to use tactical nuclear weapons, you would think that that would be a sufficiently coate threat that a court might consider taking up the case under those kind of imminent circumstances. And so I would simply say that, it takes a long time to bend the curve. And if we look back to 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed by the United Nations, I mean, we have made real progress over the better part of a century at this point. And it's based on sort of step by step. And so I would say that we need folks out there to be filing petitions regarding nuclear war when the threat of nuclear weapons is imminent. And I think that sooner or later, the cases will be taken up, hopefully, as I said, not before one is actually released, where instead of dealing with prohibiting them, we're dealing with what are the consequences with the responsibility to clean up the mess that is created. And so I just think that we are at a tipping point here in public international law where we are more likely in the near future to get a court to take this issue up. And I think we have to keep trying.
I agree, completely. And I think what you say actually is very, well, I think it's well-grounded optimism. I think there's reason to be optimistic. As you say, there's an incremental process here. And finally, a court may be pushed after lots of previous attempts to deal with this responsibly.
Thank you for that response. Now, David, you also made a comment about, you asked, your first question was on my mind when you asked it, which is what's the case law regarding, the legality of nuclear war? And the answer is, well, aside from that Weiramontree case, or where he dissented, we are not aware of the issue having been brought up. And it really strikes me that we as a coalition may want to, if we could, find a way to foment the sort of creation of a hornbook, for lack of a better term, a compilation of human rights case law. I know there are books out there. I don't know what the sort of comprehensive one would consider to be. What is the go-to, the Prosser on torts? What is the comparable thing for international human rights? It's probably a Bergenthal book, actually. But I don't know that there's something that you could look up, nuclear war and find 3 or 4 citations, to where it's been adjudicated in a nation state court and or at the ICC and or at the ICJ. And or at one of the regional, the Inter-American Commission, or issues like that. But, whether it's women's rights or children's rights or nuclear arms control and so on, I think we have to start providing, the basis. We need to sort of build the case law. We need to report the case law so that we can then speak sort of knowledgeably about, where it stands and where it could go next. Trends, if you will. Tendencies in the courts. And I think we're getting enough adjudication, enough court attention to matters of public international human rights law that a project like that, although daunting, first of all, it could potentially be accomplished through AI. If you simply scour the internet for case law in which courts, regardless of which court, have addressed international human rights issues, you might actually be able to have Copilot or something like that produce a first draft of a book.
Actually, by the way, my husband's name is Elliot Meyerowitz, and actually his book is precisely that, in the nuclear weapons area, not just courts, but other government bodies' decisions. But now, his book is somewhat dated because he wrote it in the 1990s. But others have also been, I believe, writing law review articles that kind of follow up on that approach. So I think it's a great idea. And I think it's in progress.
What's the name of the book?
The book is, I'm looking at I should have this memorized. I'm looking at my bookshelf. I'm looking at my book. Wait a minute. His book is Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the Relevance of International Law. And his last name is spelled M as in Mary, EY, ROWITZ, Elliot.
Thank you.
Sure.
As you both were talking here, one other thing that came to mind, which we didn't mention, I know we're way over time here, so I apologize. And if anyone else has any final questions, I'll take those here in just a moment. But we talked about the use or threat of nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons existence as an ultimate violation of human rights, but it's even, of course, it's a violation even of the laws, the so-called laws of war, international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions, because war is supposed to be winnable. It's supposed to be proportional, meaning only the most amount of damage that's needed to so-called win. And civilians are never supposed to be killed in war. So, but what does a nuclear war do? It kills us all. So that even under the laws of war, nuclear weapons are illegal.
Well, that is one of a major thesis in that book.
Yeah.
So my husband is a veteran, and so very sensitive to what war does.
Right.
And so the laws of war figure prominently in that work.
That completely makes sense to me. Well,
Yeah.
any final questions from anyone, or Susan, any final comments that you'd like to leave us with, maybe in a hopeful note?
Well, I think it's helpful that you wanted me to speak and said I could speak on this. So, and you've mentioned these decisions that are kind of tiptoeing around the issue, but the fact that in the ICJ decision there was that powerful, eloquent dissent. This gives me hope, and I think. I mean, I'm actually assuming uh, in my most optimistic moment that Harris wins the presidency. It occurs to me she might be someone who is smart enough and sensitive enough to be open to some of these arguments. I know her plate would be full, but this should really be front and center. So yes, that's as optimistic as I can be.
Yeah. I hear you. Yeah. Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much for spending this time with us
Thank
today.
you. Oh,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. And I would love to have you come back perhaps in the spring, sometime February, March or something, to talk about the idea of maybe a mass atrocities court, which I know you've
Yes.
researched, and even to hear about your work in children's rights.
I would be just very pleased. Very
Excellent.
pleased.
Excellent. Well, thank you so
Thank
much again
you.
today. This will be available on our YouTube channel either later today or hopefully by tomorrow. So I can share the links with everyone if you want to share it with your colleagues. So once again, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Susan, so much for your conversation with us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you,
See you
David.
soon. You're welcome. Thank you. Bye.